This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
The Nigeria Situation Room's credibility threshold for the 2027 general elections has been released, with calls to strip the president of the power to appoint the chairman, commissioners, and other presiding officers of the Independent National Electoral Commission (INEC) ahead of the next elections. Now, the calls form part of the conversation around election reforms and will be discussed by the National Assembly in subsequent plenary sessions. Joining the conversation this morning to speak to the report itself is Paul James, the programs manager at Yaga Africa. Mr. James, good morning. Thank you for joining us on the conversation.
Morning, and thank you for the invitation.
Right on. Can you give us a brief idea of this credibility threshold and why it is important?
Yeah, so at the situation room for every election beginning from 2019, what the situation has tried to do is to come up with a set of indicators that you want to see that if the commission and other institutions working around the election are able to meet, then you can look back and say this is a credibly free, fair, and transparent process. So in the 2019 election, for instance, situation had like 8 indicators. In the election in 2023, there were about 11 indicators, and out of the 11 indicators, based on the situation standard, the election did not meet up to 8 of those criteria, and based on that, the situation concluded that it was not a free, fair, credible, transparent process. Indicators, for instance, like you want to see, even in the appointment of the administrators of the election, you also want to see, you want to see credibility in the appointment of the administrators of the election. You want to see also the election, the administration itself, how transparent the commission in charge of the election was able to carry it out. You also want to see the police that also have the responsibility of managing or policing the election. To what extent were they transparent in their management of the entire election process? So if you look at that vis-a-vis how these elections were conducted and the such kind of feelers to get from Nigeria, especially about the performance of the commission from the last election, of course, it will be clear to every Nigerian to see that, there were expectations that hope were raised before the elections, but some of these expectations were met. And so based on that, you also want to hold these leaders or these institutions to account because they did not live up to the standard or to the commitment or the promises that they had made to Nigerians. If you recall before the elections, at several forums, the commission will keep stating, for instance, they were going to deploy technology or Nigerians were going to see elections with difference and all of that. Granted, we knew there were other issues or challenges that bedeviled the election. If we think about the cash funds that happened, scarcity of petroleum products before the election, and all of that. So sometimes it's also about how you manage crisis communication, just how you manage this public sentiment from every moment that people expect, the sort of communication that will coming out from this institution, a communication that should inspire hope. But if you go back to the 2023 election, I think about the kind of communication you get from INEC, most times the communications are reactive and not proactive. INEC will always come to defend something it has done or some line of thought that Nigeria criticized and all of that. There was a time, for instance, where people saw voters' cards flying up and down in the commission. It was a simple act that the commission was trying to do because at that point, there was no, if you like, maybe credible database of Nigerians that also have information of their voters card. The commission had over 10 million voters card lying fallow in its offices and needed to shift this voters card to Nigeria, but there was no way to communicate that. But the information about the location, addresses of these Nigerians were on the voters card. So what the commission was simply doing at that point in time was transferring this information from the voters card to a central location, after which I think they worked with some telecommunication companies to send text blasts to Nigerians about how and where they can pick up their voters card. I remember the exercise happened in Abuja, and over 360 voters cards were collected after that exercise. But what happened at that point was that there was no clear communication to Nigerians about the process. And by the time people begin to see voters kind of lying fallow around INEC offices or some person just entering data, people went to town with a different narrative about what was happening, which
Right.
I mean, people suspected falsely until the commission came out to clarify. So sometimes also, when you don't get this kind of clear communication from the commission, it affects voters' confidence in the process.
So, Mr. James, I'm looking at the State of Democracy report that the Situation Room put out, and I just want to plug here to let our listener know that Yaga Africa is a part of the Civil Society Situation Room. Here you have, as a collective, you've agreed to 4 reforms, electoral reforms, and I want to quickly reel them out. The first, fully implementing electronic transmission of results. Second, enforcing campaign finance regulations. Third, protecting electoral officials and voters from violence and coercion. And then the final one, which is ensuring legal sanctions for electoral offenders through special tribunals or fast-track courts. This fourth one is interesting to me because I know that for years now and in previous national assemblies, we have had a bill to establish an election offences tribunal. And that bill, for some reason, does not seem to have really moved ahead. Do you think that bill is the solution to this fourth point that you have referred to or you've suggested? Or is there a likelihood that we will see something outside of a new legislation tackle this particular issue?
I think if there is one problem that has remained is the problem of sanction, especially what I may tag as selective sanction. When electoral offenses happen, most times the people that are at the far end of the state are the ones that get to suffer from it, like the full soldiers, and not necessarily those sponsoring them. Now, the conversation about Electoral Offences Commission has been on since 2008 with the Justice Oasis Commission's report. And what I keep getting with every administration is sort of the kind of sentiments you get from the National Assembly. Now, I have these feelers from 2 years ago interacting with people on the as National Assembly's Committee on Elections, that they don't seem to think along that line of having a separate commission. I have heard the chair, Honorable Bayo, the chair, this National Assembly House Committee on Election, he had made that inference a couple of times that we don't need a separate commission to deal with that. According to him, you could empower ICPC, you could empower EFCC to carry on that. And what Nigerians have always argued is that you don't also want to overburden some of these institutions. There was at some point during the last election that INEC, for instance, was a suit to over 800 electoral offences related cases that the commission had to be running to courts every now and then. Even the commission at that point said it was overburdened and had advocated for a need to have a separate commission to be trying all of these issues. Election is so sensitive for Nigeria that I think if we want to pay attention to all of this, that is do not be too much to ask. A separate commission that can deal with all of these issues.
So, Mr. James, as we wrap this conversation, can you speak to us about the general consensus of the Situation Room regarding the state of democracy under President Bola Ahmed Tinubu?
Well, I think for every Nigerian under the Situation Room, you will look at it in the sense that we don't think, for lack of a better word, that democracy is practiced in a manner that you expect democracy to be practiced, because we want to see 3 elements to be visible in a democratic setting: inclusivity, accountability, and transparency. What you see happening at the moment is just a concern around power grabbing. Power grabbing in the sense people are shifting to the center, not necessarily because they want to represent interests of their people, but because they want to protect themselves. Most times, this shift to the center are not even done with, there's sort of not even a fallback plan or going back to the people to really have the conversation whether that truly aligns with the kind of vision that the people want or what the people wanted. Right. Everything around democracy in Nigeria is geared towards the next election, not necessarily about how do you, those elements that people want to see, the rule of law, protection of lives and properties and all of that, to what extent can we truly say as Nigerians that we have benefited from that in the last 2 years? If we look in retrospection, all the promises that the government had made before now, and then we have a checklist to check all of this, to what extent can we say Nigeria can truly say we are enjoying the dividends of the democracy?
Well, big questions to be asked and answered. But Paul James, thank you very much for speaking with us. Thank you for your time and your expertise this morning. Paul James is a programs manager at Yaga Africa, which is part of the Situation Room, and he spoke to us this morning on the Nigeria Situation Room's credibility threshold for Nigeria's 2027 elections. Big calls over the ability of the president to elect electoral officers is part of the conversation right here in this report.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.